You don't have to do that. Exactly. Yeah, if I get that, then everything. But remember, I get the thing. Okay, so like, if it goes, I can just compare it to the other. And I won't even have to do it with the probably just do some. Let's get a shot. So they probably be shot by like maybe 2 months.
Flip it on. Turn it on. Turn it on.
Yes. Thanks. All right, so see if there's anybody in today. Anybody here for the first time? No. All right. So I'll check to get my register a little bit. All right, so last week we started talking about financial intermediaries. What are they? Why are they so important, right? So, and in tutorials, we looked at the differences using the balance sheet between 2 different types of financial intermediaries. Hello. Hello. So today we're going to continue that conversation, and we're going to look at, I'm not going to go in depth with all of them, but we're going to look at some of them individually. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the depository institutions and banks, because we're going to spend most of the rest of the semester talking about depository institutions, right? But I want to spend some time talking about the other types of institutions that you don't hear about as often. Okay. Can you see in the back? Better? Okay. All right, good. Okay, so we know we started talking last week about the different types of financial intermediaries. And we know that they are depository institutions, we know that they are non-depository institutions, right? So on the depository, which are the ones we spoke about so far? Commercial banks, credit unions, contractual savings or savings institutions. So those are the main ones, that's the depository institutions. We know, however, that we now know that some insurance companies take forms of deposits because they issue fixed deposits. Some of them have annuities, it's a form of a deposit but considered an investment, right? That's not their main function. So commercial bank, savings institutions, credit unions, and we spent some time, for those who did tutorials on Friday, we spent some time on those. Depository institutions are legally able to collect deposits because it's outlined in the law, and we also know that they are quite heavily regulated, okay? Now, 30, 40 years ago, they could only take deposits and issue loans. They couldn't get involved in other financial services like insurance and investments. But over time, especially in the developed world, more in the developed world, they have gotten into investment banking services. Some of our larger banks in the Caribbean also do investment banking services, but not under the commercial bank banner. They have a separate company as a subsidiary that does the investment services. These slides are PDF slides, so they don't just change like that. All right. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I essentially said what this is about. The modern depository institutions within the United States, because this is a US textbook we're using, they were allowed to, or they are allowed to get involved in securities trading and so on. All right? However, there are limits on how much they can do, how involved they get in things like hedge funds and other private equity type of funds, right? And again, in the US, the Glass-Steagall Act was the act that gave authority to commercial banks. That act was repealed, and they passed the Financial Services Modernization Act, right? So that is how in the US that changed. Now, that would have changed, and so US banks were able to get involved in investment services. Right, so, but then the financial crisis, 2009 financial crisis, a lot of banks in the US suffered because they were involved in the investment management business, using hedge funds and also trading securities. And so there were limits to that, which were directed by the Volcker Rule which I'm not getting into, that is regulatory FINA 2001, which most of you may have done or will do. So that's not my role today. I'm going to skip through. This is a whole lot of data about the modern depository institutions in the US. We know that in terms of depository institutions, commercial banks are the biggest ones. They're the largest ones. Savings institutions, not something that we see in the Caribbean very much, but they are in the US. And of course, credit unions have risen within our market. We have seen more, or credit unions becoming more prominent. More people are moving to credit unions. And I dare say, within our jurisdiction, because of the requirements by banks, persons had moved to credit unions. However, credit unions are now asking for just as much information as the banks. The difference is you can open an account at the credit union and don't get charged the same kind of fees that you get charged at the bank. And you don't have to keep as large a balance at the credit union. Now, we would have looked at the commercial bank balance sheet, which we looked at. Most of their functions are concentrated on their balance sheet. So the collecting deposits on their balance sheet, they fall under what? Assets or liabilities? Liabilities. All right? And what would fall under assets would be their cash reserves and their loans. Those are the main things that would fall under their liabilities. Of course, under their assets. Of course, you're going to have the other, your physical assets, your lease assets, and so on. You're going to see that on your balance sheet. But the main functions of commercial banks, you see that is represented on the balance sheet. The other things they do are considered off-balance sheet activities. And so I'm going to leave that for you to read. You'll have the slides, those of you in 3076. I'll leave that for you to read. Those of you in 2005, you don't need to know all of the detail that I have here. So you will have your slides, which you refer to, and of course some supplemental reading from the textbook. All right. In terms of commercial banks, there are categories in the larger banks. So you have what we call retail banks, and we have what we call wholesale banks, right? You also have primary and secondary banks. So your retail banks, all right, they deal directly with consumers, okay, with you and I. Whereas the wholesale banks provide banking services to larger institutions. All right. Now, in the Caribbean, it's often referred to as retail banking and commercial banking. Retail banking is to consumers, you and I, whereas commercial banking is to businesses. All right. So within the bank, you have commercial banking, or they've now changed that to business banking as opposed to commercial banking. But the old foreign branch banks, Scotiabank, and so on, Barclays Bank at the time, they would refer to business banking as commercial banking, and the banking that they do with us as retail banking. So those are some distinctions. Okay, and then of course you have your primary bank, which deals directly with customers, with the public. And then you have the secondary banks, which they do most of the clearing and the settling of transactions. All right. They do accept deposits as well, but these are not ones that we're familiar with. The commercial banks in our jurisdiction, they do everything, right? But in North America in particular, they have this distinction between different types of banks and what we use. Alright, I'm skipping that because we already did that in tutorials, and those who miss your tutorial, you know that you just go through and do reading. In terms of the balance sheet, if we're completing the balance sheet, you have your liabilities, which is your deposits, all right, and any other loans that you may have with the central bank or with another commercial bank. And then the very critical part of the balance sheet for commercial banks is your equity, all right? Your equity is that capital which is going to support your institution in the event that your customers default on their loans. You have your paid-in capital, all right? And then you have capital that you would have gained because as an institution, when you make a profit, you don't pay out all in dividends, you retain some. You have retained earnings as well. The regulators, the central banks, require that banks hold a minimum amount of capital in relation to its deposits. Anybody knows what the percentage is? Capital adequacy ratio?
Is it 8%?
8%, yes. They look for 8%, and then of course, when we look at regulation later on, you see that there are different tiers of capital. How they divide up that 8% is not just the straight 8% on your assets or on your assets, but there are different tiers based on risk, the amount of risk you're exposed to. So you look at credit risk, operational risk, and so on. All right? So what I'm going through, those sheets are just, they are just looking at, they're showing you examples of banks' balance sheets, okay, and the different parts of the balance sheet, which, like I said, we'd have done a little bit of that in the tutorial. Now we know that banks engage in what we call off-balance sheet activities. Off-balance sheet activities are those activities that banks engage in that are not part of issuing loans and taking deposits. Those activities are activities that they do really to make some extra money. All right, so your balance sheet have your main functions are represented there, and then you have the off-balance sheet activities. All right, so their foreign exchange trading, their own securities trading, the loan commitments. I'm leaving you to read this. I'm skipping through it very quickly. Any sort of futures trading, derivatives trading, options, swaps, that sort of thing. Letters of credit. What's a letter of credit?
A letter that the bank gives is a case where somebody is importing stuff from overseas.
A company is importing, that the bank will give a letter of credit to say what?
So, it's a case where the person can't pay off their debt in time, the bank will just give like an assurance.
The bank gives an assurance that you're importing, this company is importing, and it has deposits at the bank that will cover the amount that the company owes you. Because when companies order, they're importing, and so they put through an order, a purchase order, to the overseas company, and that company now will ship the items without getting the money. They may get a deposit, so they ask for a letter of credit.
So every company has to have a letter of credit then?
It all depends on the arrangement they have with the
supplier?
with the supplier, yes.
Okay.
If they have a long-standing relationship with the supplier where they have where the supplier knows I'm going to get 50% when I ship, I'm going to get another 25 when it arrives, and if everything is in order. So Once you have built that relationship with the supplier, then the supplier may not ask for a letter of credit, but in a lot of instances they do. Take for example, and this is not even with shipping, but this is with services. So I don't remember if it was American Airlines or JetBlue, but the airline asks for a letter of credit to be set up on behalf of the government, so they would bring their flights in.
Okay.
All right, so they would fly to the destination. That's like a guarantee. So the Ministry of Tourism Authority, they will guarantee a certain amount of seats, and so the airline will ask that the letter of credit be set up. It all depends. Some
Right.
airlines ask for a letter of credit, some ask for a different type of arrangement where the government has to pay for, if you don't fill up the seats, the government has to pay.
Okay. Makes sense.
Right, so there's an arrangement where monies sit there, and if the seats don't fill up, then they pay. So it's a similar type of thing. Then you have commitments, and the commitment is where the bank actually says, yes, we are making the commitment to make this payment to you. It's not on the screen. To make this payment to you on behalf of the company. Yes, the company is good for it. All right, so that's your commitment, which is different, a little different from the letter of credit. So those are off-balance sheet activities. And then of course you have the fee generating activities. So you have trust services, all right, where they manage estate assets. Some banks also manage pension funds. So you have, for example, again, it's a separate, it's part of Antioch ACB group. You have ACB Mortgage and Trust. They give mortgages, and they also provide trust services to individuals and to companies. Then you have banks in the US, of course, that provide correspondent banking services. So a bank here will have an account with a bank in the US to clear any foreign drafts, US dollar drafts, any transactions that they do. And so that's corresponding banking relationship. They're able to hold accounts with the banks so that if you have somebody sending you money, it will go through that commercial bank's correspondent bank, whether in the US or in the UK, and then it's transferred to your account.
Okay.
Now, I'm not going to go into any detail with the regulation, but just so you know, like we would have said last week, financial institutions commercial banks are among the most heavily regulated, and they are regulated by central banks, and there are tools that the central bank uses to regulate. So there's, in the US, there's deposit insurance, and in some other countries, we don't currently have any at the moment, all right? But there are those, and then they use other tools to regulate the central banks. Not the central banks, to regulate the commercial banks. All right, so that's, and then they have prudential guidelines that they use, and we're gonna get into those later on, where we do a little bit more on regulation. They have what you refer to as CAMEL ratings. CAMEL stands for something, all right, which is, it's a rating system that's used to rate commercial banks by the central bank. So that's one of the tools that they use, all right? So CAMEL, capital adequacy, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, and sensitivity. So when a central bank audits a commercial bank, it looks at all of these things. Now they look at a lot more. They look at the level of risk management. They look at their systems. Okay, they don't just look at risk management, they're looking to see what types of systems they have, what types of controls they have in place. They're looking at the management team. What are the qualifications? What's their experience? Do they have enough management staff to cover the organization and all the issues that the organization will face? But we'll talk about regulation later in the course. But did everybody do FINA 2001? No, some of you don't have to take it, right? Whereas the banking and finance students have to take it. And accounting and finance, maybe not economics and finance. All right. All right, so Pearls is another rating system that they use, but I wanted to get to finance companies. Now, what a finance company is like a commercial bank, but usually it does not take deposits. All right, finance companies don't take deposits, but they give loans. So they will give consumer loans, they give business loans, they will even give mortgages. All right? In the larger countries, large corporations will also have finance companies. So if they're selling something, they may have a finance company. So for example, a car dealership would have a finance company. So in Antigua, Finance and Development Company, they would give financing for Hadid Motors and for Caribbean Premium Motors and whatever, auto, whatever. The people that, the company that sells the PMWs, right? And so they are different. They are not banks because they don't give deposits. They don't accept deposits. But how they make their money is when they issue a loan, you have to pay the interest. All right, and then of course there are fees that you pay. You have to pay negotiating fees just like a bank. All right, and they keep the business within the group of companies. So like for example, General Motors in the US, they have a financing arm. All right, and then there are some very large department stores many years ago would have had finance companies. So the examples they give here are Ford Motor Credit, Simpson Finance, and they make loans to their customers, right? There are three types of finance companies. So you have sales finance, personal credit, and business credit. Some of them give all the different types of credit. Others will specialize. All right? They tend to process loans quicker than banks. However, their interest rates are usually higher than the bank. All right? But you tend to qualify quicker than with the bank. All right? So I'm going to in terms of the regulation, so I'm gonna wrap up this and then we're gonna look at the other types of institutions, where investment banks and so on, because I think that's important for you to know. They're not as prominent around here as elsewhere, but they exist. Okay, so finance companies are either regulated by the central bank or they're regulated by a regulatory commission of some sort. So in Antigua Barbuda is the Financial Services Regulatory Commission. that regulates the finance companies, but the central bank also regulates them because they participate in the banking system. So those finance companies have accounts in the banking system, and so the central bank pays attention to them. In fact, the ECCB does regulate the finance and development company, but FSRC also has oversight as well. All right, even though they're not taking deposits. What scenario could happen that could make a finance company create a problem for the banking industry?
Perhaps if they extend the self.
All right, I don't want to
Okay. 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 Somebody else.
Somebody else.
Sorry, I talk a lot.
What could happen with a finance company that could negatively affect the banking system? That, because remember I said that the central bank regulates the finance companies even though they don't take deposits. I gave you the answer already, nobody remembers. No, nobody? So remember I said that the finance companies also have accounts with the banks, right? And if a finance company has an account with a bank and their defaults by the persons paying their loans, so they're issuing loans, right? And the bank, they are customers of the bank. If they're using the banking system, all right, to make their deposits when the customers pay in, they have checkbooks, they have to get their funds from somewhere, because remember, they're not keeping the money in the vault, all right? So when they issue a loan, they use the banking system, yeah? And so they have to pay the banks. They have to pay the banks to get funds. And so if there are defaults on their end, it could have a ripple effect on the commercial bank, depending on how large a financial institution is and what sort of balances they hold with the banking system. All right? Now, the oversight that's given to them in some jurisdictions, the scrutiny may not be as hard, or the regulator may not be as diligent, but I can assure you that ECCB goes in and checks on, for example, the finance and development company to ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're making good loans, they have sufficient capital to cover, all right, in the event of a default.
Do they give out loans without any deposits or collateral to okay?
They will take collateral.
Oh, they want collateral.
So that's part of how they're able to issue the loan.
Okay.
So they take collateral, whether it be property or cash
Payments. Okay. But one more question: what if I have like a debt? I already have a loan from a bank, but I don't have enough money. Perhaps I can go to a finance company. Would they check the bank and so on?
Yes, they would. Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. Yes.
All right.
Okay. Now you have your access and so on, but they are making sure that they come to your employer and your employer signs to say, yes, we are going to send this payment to you every month. Straight out of their paycheck, we're going to send it to you.
Okay.
So they
Okay.
do that to
Oh,
try
okay.
to guarantee.
Yeah.
Right? So they may not do the credit check, they just want to know
You just
that
study.
you have a job and your employer will send you. And
Okay.
if you really recognize with those ones, those loans are shorter term loans. Right? And the interest rate is exorbitant.
Yeah, I
Right?
heard
It can be 25%. It can be 18, all the way up to 28%.
And I hear,
That's not regulated.
and they say that, can I say that it's also that it even though you pay like the interest or whatever for one period, it's still gonna have to pay like a full amount at the end, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, so you're paying a lot of interest. All right. Any questions on that? Please, I can't stress enough, the reading is going to be really, really important. All right? Just making sure that you're staying on top of your reading. I suspect that many of you have not read chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1 and 2, they're long, but you need to read that.
All right. Security funds.
All right, so in terms of the other types of finance institutions, we have